welcome to New Jersey Politics with Laura Jones. I am Laura Jones, and we are so glad to have you here. Today, we are joined by New Jersey author Tim Castano, and we're going to learn about his experience in state and global politics and how it influenced his latest book, Wildwood. We're also going to get his thoughts on the current political landscape. Tim is standing by. First, we are going to be looking at the congressional races here in New Jersey and the first general election congressional debate. Joey Fox, a reporter for the New Jersey Globe, is here to help us navigate what is happening across the Garden State. Joey, welcome back to the show. It's always good to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Laura.
Yep. All right. So we are going to talk about New Jersey's congressional races. You cover New Jersey's congressional delegation in Washington. So what races are the ones to watch this year going into November?
I think in terms of House races, the list kind of starts and ends with the 7th district. So this is a district that Democrats flipped in 2018, Republicans flipped back in 2022. And it was drawn in the most recent redistricting cycle to be sort of New Jersey's premier swing district, and it's really living up to that title. The incumbent Republican is Tom Kean Jr. He's the son of the former governor, Tom Kean. He was a state senator for many years and then won his seat in Congress in 2022. The Democrat is Sue Altman, who was a progressive activist who's now making her first run for public office. It's an interesting matchup of styles. You know, you've got a very, very mild-mannered congressman in Tom Kean Jr., who, has always been someone who's been very focused on sort of the nitty-gritty of the job, and he's not someone who makes a ton of headlines for himself, although he did run for U.S. Senate back in 2006 against Bob Menendez. So clearly there is some ambition in him. And then you've got Sue Altman, who is very much on the opposite side of the spectrum in terms of, she is always out there, always sort of pushing the button on these things. They've raised a ton of money. They're both in the several millions of dollars. This district voted for Joe Biden by a little less than 4 percentage points. We don't know how it's going to vote this year for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. But so basically everything about this race points towards it being an extremely competitive election. Both parties are treating it as such. Right. And I think that unless you're seeing a night where one party or the other is doing shockingly well in general, the 7th district is really going to be the one that you're going to want to watch. And in a case where the House is extremely close and where Democrats and Republicans are winning about the same number of seats, this is one of those seats that you could expect to see as the dividing line, where if Republicans win it, then they maybe keep the House. If Democrats flip it, then they maybe flip the House.
Yeah, and we have the first congressional debate set with Tom Kean and Sue Altman. You're going to be part of the panel. I'm moderating. What do you think we're going to be hearing from the candidates? Of course, we'll come up with our own questions, but what messages do you think those candidates are going to be trying to get across to the voters?
I mean, I think a lot of it is going to be each of them trying to convince voters to the extent possible that they represent the true middle of the road of this very moderate swingy district and that their opponent is out of step. So you're probably going to have Altman bring up Trump and Kean bring up Harris. We don't really know which of those is more effective yet because we don't know how those two candidates are going to be doing in this district. You're almost certainly going to see a long discussion of abortion. Altman has run very strongly on the pro-abortion rights message, and that's something that will almost certainly resonate in this district. Kean has called himself pro-choice in the past, but he hasn't necessarily had an especially pro-abortion access record in Congress. You're definitely going to see some discussions of Altman's past in sort of progressive activist circles. She is not running on a left-wing message this year, but the groups that she's been part of in the past have definitely been on the more progressive end of New Jersey politics, and that's already something that the Kean campaign has tried to draw attention to, and it will certainly come up again at the debate. So I feel like that's going to be sort of what this is a battle of. And we've seen this in many debates before. This is sort of where American politics is right now, which is each party saying, the real American, the American that we're not seeing, in the media or on social media or whatever, but the real American who really represents the core of the electorate in this country is on my party's side. And this other party is way out of whack with them on X issue, abortion, immigration, and the economy, whatever it may be.
Yeah. And the other thing about this particular seat, which is interesting, is because it does flip back and forth. You don't have, Tom Kaine Jr. is just going on not even 2 years in the seat, so he doesn't really have much of a congressional record to stand on. Of course, he was
Right.
a state senator. So can you talk a little bit about those dynamics? You don't see a lot of him. He doesn't do a lot of media one-on-one interviews. He's out and about doing constituent services. So can you just talk about how that factors in as far as, so many campaigns, there are so many safe districts where people just point to their records and continuing those records. Tom Kaine Jr. doesn't have that, nor does Sue Altman, having not run for this before.
Well, I don't know if I fully agree about that because Kaine has a very long record in the legislature. And obviously, those are different votes than the type of votes he'll be taking in Congress. But I mean, Kaine is not all that old, but he's been in public office for something like over 20 years. I forget the exact year that he came into office. So there's a lot in his record, that can be a positive for him or that could be a negative if Altman wants to go after it. You're right that this is a district that it cycles through a lot of Congress people. It's not like the type of district like, you've got Chris Smith in the 4th district who's been there since 1980. This is not that seat. This is a district that has been through 5 or 6 members of Congress in the last few decades. It was Republicans for a while. Then Tom Malinowski flipped it in 2018 from Leonard Lance, who was the Republican congressman at the time. And then Kaine flipped it back in 2022. Okay. So that does, you're right, create a bit of a thinner record. It also means that, unlike someone who's been in Congress for a couple of decades and might have a committee chairmanship or a long history of constituent service like that, you haven't had someone quite be able to build up that level of a history in the House. I don't know, in this very polarized era, I don't know how many voters will be thinking about that specifically. There's a ton of voters now, more so than in the past, who will just see the party label of a candidate and say, well, that probably means that they'll align with my beliefs enough that I'll vote for them, more so than any individual characteristics of that candidate. But you're right that could be, we got a freshman congressperson against a first-time candidate, 2 people who have not been long for the congressional world. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, and when you look at the congressional seats, there's not even one that you can say, well, which one is the safest? Because most of the congressional seats, the way it's drawn, it benefits the incumbent. And you do have people like Chris Smith who have been there, for decades. Congressman Bill Pascrell. So many people who have been there for so long. The other open seat, so to speak, is in that 3rd district where Andy Kim is vacating it to run for U.S. Senate. So what are your thoughts on the other ones? Again, keeping in mind that, as you said, the 7th is going to really be the most competitive, the one to watch. But what about the other districts? Is there such thing as really a truly safe district?
There are definitely some safe districts. Yeah, Chris Smith's district is safe. There's a few urban North Jersey districts that are extremely safe. And you're right. Part of it is the way that the map was drawn. There were a couple of districts in both directions that were specifically drawn to help one party or the other. And also, this is just how political geography sometimes works. You are not going to get a district that's based in Newark or Jersey City that's going to elect a Republican, because that's just how those cities vote. So yeah, there are a few districts we can take off the table. Rob Menendez, who won his primary after a really intense battle, he's completely fine, regardless of what happens, what has already happened with his dad. That's too much of a safe seat for it to matter even slightly. We've got LaMonica McIver, who's the nominee for a special election in a Newark-based seat. She's also completely safe. Bonnie Watson Coleman, safe. Frank Pallone, safe. I don't need to go through every single name. Right. And I think if I was to bring up another seat that I was looking at, it would be that open Kim seat. The Democratic nominee is an assemblyman named Herb Conaway. He's been in the legislature for several decades, built up a long history there, a lot of relationships there that sort of worked out in his favor this year when he wanted to run for a congressional seat. And it turns out he had a lot of friends to do so. So he beat a fellow member of the assembly and a few other candidates in the primary with the strength of those relationships. Yeah. The Republican candidate is more of a newcomer. He's a physician named Rajesh Mohan, who ran for local office once and didn't win. This is one of those races where you kind of have to read the tea leaves into what the parties are doing, where, you can look at the partisanship of the district. This was, Joe Biden won it by 14 points. Andy Kim, when he ran for re-election last time, won it by 12. So that's one data point that you have. But then are the candidates raising a lot of money? Are the parties airing ads in the district that are promoting their own candidate? As a journalist, am I getting pitches from like campaign committees saying, hey, did you see this opposition research on this candidate? Or did you see our new ad on that? That's not really happening in this district or in any district that's not the 7th so far.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Sometimes races break late, so I wouldn't say never.
Right.
But the parties have, and also sometimes there are races that completely surprise both of the parties. And so it's a race that no one was telling us as journalists, like, oh, you should look at this. And then all of a sudden on election day, something crazy happens. So,
right. I mean, this New Jersey, you don't know what's going to happen.
Right. And famously in New Jersey a few years ago, you had Ed Durr defeat the incumbent state Senate President Steve Sweeney in a race that absolutely no one was paying attention to. So won't rule out anything, but there are certain indicators that people who follow these things closely will use to see when a race is starting to really grab attention. And it's only been the 7th district so far this year.
Yeah, and just one other follow-up as we kind of close out this segment. Again, as a reporter, are you hearing any Republicans still trying to tie that conviction of Senator Bob Menendez to the other races? You mentioned that Rob Menendez's his seat is very safe. He has not been tied to that at all. In the primary, it was a very different story. The Hoboken mayor was trying to paint them as one corruption. Will this play out in the other congressional races, not the race for U.S. Senate, but those other congressional seats?
I mean, so I don't know how voters will necessarily approach the news of Menendez. It clearly hurt his son in that primary. But I think the fact that Democrats have been pretty resolute in saying this guy needs to go since the day of the indictment will kind of limit the drag that Menendez has on other candidates, especially given that, by the time Election day rolls around, the senator will have already been out of office for several months. It'll all be a little bit in the rearview mirror. And I know you said not to focus on the U.S. Senate race, but just like the races where Republicans might most want to try to tie Democrats to Bob Menendez, which is the Senate race with Andy Kim and then the 7th district race with Sue Altman, they kind of have the misfortune of both Democrats there being extremely anti-Menendez candidates. Andy Kim got in the race explicitly to deny renomination to Bob Menendez. Sue Altman has been in these sort of progressive, not directly anti-Menendez necessarily, but sort of anti-party machine, anti the process that led to something like Bob Menendez. She's been in those circles for years. And I'll be curious to see whether there are ads that try to make this connection, but I don't really know whether it will stick, because I think that the two candidates they'd most likely to like to apply it to are ones who it really is not a good fit.
Right. It's something that they took a stand on early in the campaign, and it worked for them, or it worked for Andy Kim, certainly in the primary. And it is amazing to look back and see how much has changed since Menendez was indicted, and how the county lines have all changed, just the amount of change. Like a week can be a lifetime in politics. Just final thoughts
It's
here.
been less than a year, and we're already just in a completely different reality than we were if we were talking about this a year ago.
Exactly.
It's wild.
Exactly. Joey Fox, New Jersey Globe, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Laura.
We're joined today by New Jersey author Tim Castano. In addition to his credits as a writer, he's worked in state as well as global politics, and those are experiences that have helped inform his latest novel, Wildwood. We're going to talk to him about New Jersey's influence on his writing, along with his thoughts on this state's past and current political landscape. Tim, welcome. I'm so happy to see you. Congratulations on the new novel. Good to see you.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's great to be here. I realize, Laura, we've known each other for almost a quarter century.
Is it that long?
Yet neither of us has changed. So
it is amazing. Time has just indeed stood still while everything around us is just unraveled.
Yes.
Well, let me ask you a question that many writers are going to have to answer. What is Wildwood about?
So Wildwood spotlights the human toll of policy failures. And so the book takes place in the year 2035 primarily, so almost 10 years in the future from where we are now. And climate change and weather events have rendered Wildwood virtually uninhabitable, save for one thriving industry, which is expanded medical aid in dying, or physician-assisted suicide. So it's a beach read, it's a bright beach read. But what New Jersey in this version of in this future version is one of several states that has expanded its medical aid in dying law more liberally. So the parameters have extended so that conditions beyond just immediate medical conditions now qualify for the procedure. And in the story, it focuses on 4 individuals from varying backgrounds and disparate backgrounds who, for various reasons, circumstances beyond their control, really, are beset by different unfortunate events that then propel them to travel to Wildwood to consider facilitating their own ends. So when I say it's about policy failures, it really looks at, say, the policy architecture, some of the economic insecurity, a lot of the issues with the healthcare system, workforce issues that, I think lead these particular individuals, and I think some of us can relate to it as well ourselves, to consider, options that they otherwise wouldn't. And that's really the basis of the story.
Well, let me ask you what motivated you to select Wildwood, New Jersey as a setting for what some might really consider a controversial premise?
One would think that I actually spent a lot of time in Wildwood, and I have not. So I went there once, I think, to the boardwalk when I was in college. But then during the pandemic, when looking for a socially distanced activity, just decided to drive through and tour it, and I immediately was struck by the town. Really fell in love with it aesthetically initially, just because it really is. It's one of the highest concentrations of mid-century modern architecture in the United States, and it's such a fun aesthetic that it carries. And from there, just started reading and learning more about it, and it's a fascinating place. So it's got a great history. Just it is the birthplace of rock and roll. Dick Clark hosted the first American bandstand there, and then even going farther back to its origins with Native Americans actually traveled there. It's ultimately the first, beach town in North America, you could argue, since they went there during the off season, and then the colonial times, and up through really the explosion at the mid part of the last century. So post World War II, when you had the birth of really the middle class, you had automobiles becoming more prominent with American families, and they needed somewhere to go, and hence, Wildwood was the place to go. So that really is what drew me to it. And I had the idea after spending some time there and researching that I wanted to set a book there, but I didn't know about what. And then a couple of years ago, I read, I think it was late 2022, early 2023, there were stories about Canada's medical aid in dying law and how they suspected certain individuals who were impoverished actually were taking advantage of it. When I say taking advantage, I mean, I don't mean it pejorative context, but so that poverty and loneliness were actually driving some of the decisions. And that really struck me, and that made me sad, but then it clicked and it all came together for the idea where it's a scenario that is not entirely implausible, and that's how the story wove together.
Yeah, and I know I'm familiar with some of the reports about people in Canada and the decisions they've made, and they are very, very controversial, and you have to wonder, gosh, what happened to where you get to that point. But I want to ask, you've had 3 novels published, and each is based in New Jersey. So what is it about New Jersey that makes for such a compelling backdrop, both for you and other writers as well?
I'm glad you mentioned,
but mainly you.
Well, New Jersey has such a fantastic literary tradition. So many authors either were born here or spent a lot of time here. From Toni Morrison, Nobel Prize winner, spent so many years at Princeton. Joyce Carol Oates, Thornton Wilder, even though he was born in Wisconsin, did some of his most important writing here in New Jersey when he was working at Lawrenceville School. The Pulitzer Prize winner from 2 years ago, Joshua Cohen, is from Cape May County. So many, Allen Ginsberg, Philip Roth. I'm not at my house. If we were at my house, by the way, I would have a great prop right now, which is I own Philip Roth's clock.
Really?
So there was a clock that was in his home in Connecticut, and they held an auction, as the state held an auction a few years ago. I actually won the clock, so I have it. And, I told my nieces, whose clock that is, Philip Roth? And they're like, we have no idea who that is. But in any event, so many writers. And what makes New Jersey such an interesting place, I think, is, really the microcosm of the United States. the topography, the economy. You have such a diverse population. You have, a shoreline. You have a unique ecosystem with the pinelands, which is essentially a desert. You have mountains, you have cities, you have rural areas, you have extraordinary wealth, but also poverty as well, all living in such close proximity. And I think that just makes it adds such a dynamism to the town, to the state, and also the fact that we do have so many municipalities and individual communities, which themselves have their own character and individual character. So I think it lends itself so well to any various media, whether it be music, whether it be literature, poetry, film, and there's almost no reason to leave as a writer because it's all happening within New Jersey.
Yeah. Well, and New Jersey politics, it offers an endless supply of characters and plot ideas for any writer, and it's hard to believe we're at the 20th anniversary mark of Jim McGreevey resigning. And you served in the McGreevey administration, so I'm curious if you have any reflections on that moment, 2 decades later.
Hard to believe. Yeah, this is also, I realized it because it was my brother's 20th wedding anniversary this summer. And I thought, well, what else happened Oh, that's right.
I had a baby. I had a baby too.
Oh, you had a baby. Okay, yeah.
I went out on maternity leave. The day after I went on maternity leave, that's when Jim McGreevey was making the announcement. And I'm thinking, really? You couldn't do it the day before?
August 12th, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say 3 things come to mind. Foremost, I just have to say, I'm a big fan of Jim McGreevey's. I'm grateful to him for the opportunities he gave me. I really, he was always so good to me and still is. And I just, appreciate everything. Yes, it was an ignominious conclusion. But nevertheless, I remain proud to have worked in the administration. I made terrific friends, just had great experiences. So that's foremost. When I think of, the McGreevey experience, that's front of mind. And also, I don't want to overstate. I was a staffer, so I was not near any of the decisions. I learned about this really only minutes before the actual announcement itself, which then my second point, reflecting on how information traveled at that point in time. So 20 years ago versus today, how would that story, if it happened today, how would we cover it? How would we hear about it? And, that's fascinating to think about. And for days and weeks afterward, there was so much speculation as to what did occur, but there really weren't as many tributaries for that speculation to travel because there was no social media. The internet was still, somewhat in its infancy. I mean, you had certain outlets, but not what it is today. And it's interesting to reflect. Was it better? Was it worse? But that's the other part. It was a strange period. And then thirdly, when I think about it, an odd outcome is how it engendered empathy in that, when you go through something like that, especially earlier in your career, you realize, well, there's so many of us who just show up for work every day. We have nothing to do with this. But then suddenly that's all anyone wants to talk about is, did you know? What did you know? And we didn't know. And, it becomes somewhat salacious and it's unfortunate. And, even at the time, there were publications in New Jersey that then, after the fact, were looking into the backgrounds of everyone who worked for Jim McGreevey, understandably so, but also frustratingly so. And, then when seeing subsequent situations with other officials, immediately the empathy I feel for those who work for them and work with them. So I think one of the first that occurred afterward was Eliot Spitzer and Governor Spitzer, and just that day, feeling just tremendous empathy for the people who worked with him and for him, who then found themselves, their lives upended and uprooted. And, that continues. So it's not just politics. It's, it's any discipline or industry where something like that happens. There was something with the Boston Celtics 2 years ago, and, instantly felt empathy for the individuals caught up in its wake. And
right. Yeah, those unintended consequences. We have time for one more question, and I can't let you go without talking about, this year providing its share of major headlines, consequential events, from the conviction of Senator Bob Menendez to the First Lady's campaign to replace him, to the indictment of South Jersey, a very powerful figure, George Norcross. So how would you, a writer, and capture these episodes, and what do you think those themes would look like?
So I think the message is better to leave 3 hours too soon than a minute too late. That was from Merry Wives of Windsor. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Yeah, I think as much as things change, they stay the same. That's sort of the theme to New Jersey politics. I mentioned when we met, you and I met, almost 25 years ago, we worked on a show devoted to the 2000 election cycle. And, I was thinking back to that, and there you had, if George Bush wins, Governor Whitman leaving, how will that influence the 2001 election? You had Corzine and Florio, so South Jersey and North Jersey, sort of a battle going on there. You had Tom Kaine running for Congress in 2000. And then I think about some of the guests we had. Among our first guests were Jim Treffinger, Sharp James, and Bob Januszewski, and all three then ended up going to prison. So, as we look at 2024, 2020, there's so many similarities. And I think I mentioned there's just this inherent dynamism in New Jersey with our politics, because we have elections every year, because we have so many municipalities, so much government, and it just lends itself to so many possibilities. So that's it. And the story writes itself. So it's hard to even think about actually sitting down and writing something, because truth is stranger than fiction.
So true. So true. Tim Castano, the book is called Wildwood. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Oh,
it
thank
is
you.
such a pleasure. Always good seeing you.
Really, thank you very much.
Thank you. And that'll do it for today. I'm Laura Jones. Thanks so much for watching New Jersey Politics. We look forward to seeing you back here next time.